In this video, you will learn how to create a login and sign up page using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. On the HTML side, I'm going to explain all the elements and attributes that you need to fully understand how input elements and form data works. On the CSS side, I'm going to turn everything into this modern and responsive design. We have hover effects going on, a focus state when you access the input field, and even a red variant if the user enters something wrong. But how do we detect that something is wrong? For that, we use JavaScript. We can use DOM manipulation and if conditions like the password has to be longer than 8 characters and many more to ensure that we have a working form validation on the front-end side before you connect this to your own backend. Of course, I'm going to explain everything as beginner-friendly as possible, although basic HTML, CSS and JavaScript knowledge is recommended. My name is Fabian and this is Coding to Go, the channel where you'll learn the most relevant coding concepts in just a few minutes. We're going to start with the signup.html page. Create the HTML backbone and change the title to sign up. Our first element in the body is going to be a wrapper, which is just a div with the class wrapper. We also have a heading, sign up. On the right side, there will be the website in the browser. For the sign up, we need a form. I will remove the action attribute, but you may use this for your own backend. Each input field inside the form will have its own div container, because this will help us position our icons next to it. The input field will have a lot of attributes. The type is text. The name is first name, the ID is first name input, and the placeholder is also first name. Now what do these attributes do? The type controls what kind of input data this form is going to hold. As a first name is no special kind of data, it will just be plain text. The name attribute will be important to extract the form data when you submit the form to the backend. But this depends entirely on what type of technology you'll be using. The ID, first name input, is important so that we can identify the element later with JavaScript. And the placeholder is simply the hint to the user what he needs to enter. Now let's copy the entire div to do the same thing for the email input. This one is of type email. The name is email, the ID is email input, and the placeholder is also email. We do the same thing for the password. Type password, name password, ID password input, and placeholder password. In theory, all of these inputs could be of the type text. It doesn't matter that much, but if the browser knows that this is a password input, he will hide the characters with these dots, which is quite useful. And some browsers will even prevent the form from submitting when an input element of type email does not contain a real email address, meaning the user has to write a correct email address with the @ symbol and all of that for it to work. This is also quite useful. Also, as you can see, we are using Firefox, and Firefox has a password manager working here, so he knows that this is a password input and we could access the password manager. Now let's copy the div one more time to create the last input element, which is the repeat password field. The type is still password. The name is repeat password, ID is repeat password input, and placeholder is repeat password. Now in the browser, we should have 4 input elements. Let's create a sign up button to submit the form. The type of this button is submit, and its content is sign up. When we click the button, we can see that this form is submitted. The website refreshes, unless the browser prevents the form from submitting. Some browsers will prevent this if you haven't provided a real email address. When working with input fields, you might also want to consider a few more attributes. The first one is required. If you write the required attribute, you force the user to enter input to that element. The form will not be submitted if this field is empty. If you write disabled, then this element will not be functioning. The user cannot use it. This is quite useful if you want to force the user to do something else instead. Setting these attributes in JavaScript will help you create complex forms where not all elements are accessible. They are good to know, but you will not be needing them in this tutorial. But what we do need in this tutorial are icons, because they will make everything look much better and professional. For that, we go to fonts.google.com/icons. In the search bar, we search for person icon, which is this one right here. We also go to filters and turn the fill switch on. That way the icon is filled with color. Then we download this icon as an SVG file. Not PNG, but SVG, because we want to be able to customize this icon in HTML. Now we do the same thing for the log icon. Download SVG. And while we're at this, we can also download our background image at pexels.com. You can choose any background image you want. I will search for abstract background purple. I choose this one right here. If you want to use the exact same background image, you can use the link in the video description. The original image is very big. We don't need 5000 pixels. So we can choose a different size, large. This will minimize our website's loading time. Now we can download the selected size. All of these images on Pexels are free to use, even for commercial use. We don't necessarily have to give credit, and nothing bad will happen to you, unless you do bad stuff with this image. But we will be fine for this project. Now that we have downloaded everything, we can close everything and go back to our project. Open your File Explorer and drag and drop everything into your VS Code project. I also renamed the background image to keep things easy. Let's add our icons to the form. Inside the div, we create a label for our first name input. And then add our icon. So we open the SVG file and copy the entire HTML element that is inside. We paste this into the label. It looks very complicated because we have a very long SVG element, but it is just the way SVG elements look in HTML. And this is actually very good because we can change everything about this icon by simply adjusting its attributes. You cannot do that with normal PNG images. When we have this and we save and refresh, we can see the person icon in the browser. When we click on this icon, the cursor is placed inside the input, which is pretty cool. This only works because we use the for attribute and the ID first name input to connect the label with our first name input. And that's why this works perfectly. Now we do the same thing for the email input. Create a label for email input. And inside the label, we actually don't need an icon, we can create a span instead. Here I enter the @ symbol. This is sort of representative for email addresses. Now we add a label for the password input as well. And this time we're going to use the SVG for the log icon. Copy everything and paste it there. And we do the same thing for the repeat password input. We also paste the log icon here. And now in the browser, when we click on these icons, we should be able to access all these input fields perfectly. Now the last thing in our HTML code is going to be the link to the login page. We have all been there that we try to log into our account, but we're actually in the sign up page, even though we already have an account. So to help the user, we create a p tag and write already have an account, and then add a link to the login.html page, login. So when the user is on the wrong page, they can easily use this link to go to the login page. The login does not exist yet, but we're going to create this later. Now the HTML code for the sign-up page is completed. Let's style this website with CSS. Create a link:/CSS reference in the HTML head that refers us to our style.css file. We also have to create this file, style.css. The first thing to do is to import our font family. So we go to the infamous website fonts.google.com and we search for Poppins. Click on Get Font and use the Add Import rule between the two style tags to add this to our CSS file. Just copy and paste everything. Now we can create the variables for this project. Our color palette. We have an accent color, a base color, a text color, and an input color variable. These are just the colors that I'm going to use in this project. You can choose different colors if you like. Now one thing that I always like to do at the beginning is to set all margins and paddings to 0. This will give us a clean starting point. In the HTML selector, I will set up the font for the entire website. We're using Poppins and provide a few backup fonts if Poppins doesn't work. The font size is 12 points. The color is our variable text color. And text align is centered to have centered text everywhere. Now let's take care of the body. It has a min height of 100 viewport height, and we apply a background image using the URL method. This points to our file background.jpg. If you didn't rename the file, then you will have a more complex name here. The background size is cover to show the entire image, and background position is right to put it on the right side. The overflow is set to hidden to make sure that this is not a scrollable website. Now let's apply the styles for the wrapper. The background color is the variable base color, which is white. The height is 100 viewport height. And the width is using the max function to say that it should be either 40% or 600 pixels wide, depending on what value is bigger. This means this will make the wrapper 40% wide with a mid-width of 600 pixels. We also add a padding of 10 pixels. To give our design a little extra, we can apply a border radius, where only the two corners on the right side are going to be round. For that, we have to apply 4 values, 1 for each corner. 0 for top left, 20 pixels for top right, 20 pixels for bottom right, and 0 for bottom left. Now on the website, we can only see the border radius working on one corner. Since we have a height of 100 viewport height and a padding, the wrapper is bigger than the window, and the border radius is happening outside of the screen. To fix that, we need to apply box sizing border box. That means that all borders and paddings will be created inwards. Now that we have done that, the border radius should be visible. Now let's center the content using Flexbox. Let's take care of the H1 heading. Font size is 3 rem, meaning 3 times the initial font size. Font weight is 900, so it will be very bold. And text transform uppercase to have only uppercase letters. For the form, I will apply a width of minimum 400 pixels or 100%. This function will always return the smaller value of the two. Normally, 400 pixels is smaller than 100%, so that will be the width of the form. On smartphone screens, we reach a point where 100% is actually smaller than 400 pixels, and then 100% was going to be returned by the function. Pretty cool. Let's also add a margin top and bottom. We apply display flex, flex direction column, align items center, and a gap of 10 pixels to have an organized layout inside the form. The direct child div of the form are going to be these 4 containers that have the label and the input field inside. Applying a width of 100%, display flex, and justify content center will turn this into a flexbox layout. This is important because we want to apply a few flexbox properties to the child elements. The label should have a flex string of 0 because we want a fixed size of 50 pixels times 50 pixels. The background color is our variable accent color, and the fill is the base color. The fill property is used to control the color of SVG elements, so our icons can actually be colored because we're using SVG elements. This is not possible with PNGs. So this property is working for the icons, but not for the @ symbol, because this is just normal text inside a span. For that, we can use the normal color property. Let's also apply a border radius to handle each corner individually. We only want to round off the corners on the left side. Let's center these icons inside the labels using the common Flexbox way. I also increase the size of the @ symbol by using the font size and font weight properties. Now to my favorite part of the CSS design, which is the input fields. They are using box sizing border box to maintain a consistent size, and we use flex grow of 1 and min width of to have fully responsive resizing of the element. Its height is 50 pixels, which is exactly the same size as the labels, and the padding is 1 em. And that's why we applied box sizing border box, because otherwise this padding would have changed the total height of the input. We inherit all the font settings and apply a border radius for the 2 corners on the right. The border is none, and the background color is our variable input color. Now let's add a hover effect. I want to add a border of 2 pixels solid accent color. This will look like that. Let's also add a transition to the input element to make it smoother. But one thing that is kind of weird when adding borders is the way it appears. It sort of grows from the edges inwards, and I personally don't like that. The borders don't look great. So what we are going to do instead, we add the border to the input element in its initial state. But we make this border invisible by coloring it with the input color. This is the same color as the background color. So there's a border of 2 pixels, but since it has the same color as the background, we can't see it. And now in the hover state, we only change the border color to accent color. And that way we don't have this weird growing of the edge, but instead a smooth color change. It's just a tiny detail, but if you know, you know. Another tiny detail is the border on the left side. It makes the label look bigger than it is, so I'm going to remove it using border left none. And now we have the perfect hover effect. Let's take care of the focus. The focus is what we call when the input field is accessed. On focus, every browser sort of handles it differently, but what they all have in common is this ugly outlining of the element. It shows us that this input field is active. To change how it looks, we need to use the focus pseudo class. We apply outline none. Now we have basically no focus effect going on. Instead, I'm just going to use the border color property. We apply the text color variable. Let's also change the background color of the label right next to it. This will make it look even better. Since the input and the label are on the same hierarchy level in the HTML code, it can be quite difficult to select it in CSS, because the label comes before the input. But luckily, CSS has now the has selector. This will serve as a parent selector for us. So we access the div that has the input where the focus is applied. So we're selecting the parent div. Inside the div, we take the label. And here we can change the background color to text color. And now, when we enter the input, the label will change its background color. Actually, all the labels are now colored. To fix this, we have to specify this selector even further by using the direct children combinator. Now, only the direct children of the div that has the input focused will change its background color. Perfect. If you want, you can also change the placeholder. Let's change the color and apply the text color. Now, as we can see, the color did not change that much. It looks almost exactly like before. The text color should be much darker. The reason for that is quite simple. The placeholder has a different opacity. We can adjust the opacity and set this to 1, for example. Then it will be colored properly. We could also change this color to the accent color if you want. But I'm just going to use the text color and keep the opacity slightly transparent, as it was before. Now let's style the button. It has a margin top of 10 pixels, no border, rounded corners, a slight padding of 0.85 em top and bottom, and 4 em left and right. If you're not familiar with em, that is just a unit that refers to the font size of the element. 0.85 is basically 85% of the font size, and 4 em is 4 times the font size. Background color is accent color. Let's also inherit the font settings from above and make the font weight slightly bolder. Text transform uppercase, and cursor is pointer to improve the hover state. On hover, I also want to change the background color to text color. Let's add a transition to make the color change smoother. Buttons also have a focus. You will see this when you navigate the form using the tab key. This will move the focus around. By default, the button has this ugly outline. So let's remove this here too. Instead, we change the background color. This will look a lot better. To improve the look of the link down here, I will remove the text decoration and change its color to accent color. On hover, we can add the text decoration underline again. So this way we don't have underline, and when we hover over it, we do have an underlining. And that should be the desktop design for our sign up. Let's see how this looks on other screen sizes by inspecting the page in the browser. When we resize the window, we can see that this does not look good. The elements are leaving the screen. So let's make this website responsive by adding a media query. When the max width is 1100 pixels, we select the wrapper and change its width. Remember, earlier we applied a width of 40% or 400 pixels, depending on what is bigger. Now we need to change that, because these 400 pixels are preventing it from being responsive. But the width cannot be 40% either, because that is just way too small. Instead, we need to use the min function to apply either 600 pixels or 100%. Now it's depending on which value is smaller. On tablet screens, 600 pixels is in fact smaller, so this is going to be the width. And on smartphone screens, 100% of the screen width is actually smaller than 600 pixels, so that is going to be the width. The wrapper is going to be sized responsively, following the dimension of the device perfectly. Let's also remove the border ranges, because we don't want that anymore. On smartphone screens, they are not going to see the background image anyways. The CSS design is now finished. But before we take care of the form validation in JavaScript, let's create a version of how the input fields should look if something is incorrect. In JavaScript, we want to apply a class, which is called incorrect, to the element where the user made a mistake. Then certain styles will be applied that we can customize right now. Let's hardcode this into our HTML code by applying the class incorrect to the first div. We will do this later in JavaScript, but for now let's do it in HTML to see how it looks. In CSS, we can style this element for how it should look if it's incorrect. We access the label that is inside and change the background color to this red type of color. Red is always good to communicate an error. We also access the input element inside the incorrect div and change the border color to red as well. In the browser, we can see how this would look like. We can see the first element is incorrect. But I'm noticing an inconsistent user experience here. The hover and focus state of the input are sort of overwriting the incorrect state. As we can see, the color is changing when I hover over the element. I want this to persist and be more powerful than the hover state. The element should still be red if it's wrong, no matter if we hover over it. This is happening because these two styles are conflicting. To understand why this is happening, we need to understand CSS specificity. The selector specificity of the incorrect input selector is 0, 1, 1. If we go up and look at the selector for the input hover state, we can see that this specificity is 0, 1, 2, so it is bigger. In CSS, when two rules are conflicting, the one with higher specificity wins. which is why the hover state overrides the incorrect state. If we want the incorrect state to win, we need to increase its specificity. We can do that by specifying the selector a bit more. Let's just add the info that this is a form with a div that has the class incorrect. And this will already make the selector more specific and therefore increase its specificity. As we can see, the hover state will now be ignored because the incorrect specificity is now higher. Alright, and that should be it for the CSS part of this tutorial. The class incorrect can now be added to all the div elements that we think are wrong, and the styles will follow accordingly. Now let's implement the real logic for that in JavaScript. Create a new file, validation.js, and import this properly in our HTML head. This is a script tag with the type text/JavaScript using the source validation.js. We are also using the defer attribute. This is very important because it ensures that the JavaScript code is only imported when the HTML code has finished loading. This is very important because in our JavaScript code we will be accessing HTML elements. And if they don't exist in the moment this file is loaded, then we will get a lot of errors. The defer attribute will wait that millisecond that our HTML code takes to load, and only then the JavaScript code will be executed. So always remember to write the defer attribute. Alright, once we got that, we can start with the JavaScript part of this video. First, we need to get all our elements into variables. We have a form that we need to get using its ID form. For that, we need to actually give our form an ID. In the HTML code, apply ID form. Then we also have our first name input. We are also getting this using getElementById, first name input. And since all our elements have an ID, we can copy this line several times and do the same thing for every input. Because we also have an email input, a password input, and a repeat password input. Also make sure to not forget the IDs in the parentheses. Now that we have our elements in JavaScript, we can add an event listener to the form. Form.addEventListener. We are waiting for the submit event. This event will be fired once the form is submitted. This could happen when the user hits the sign up button or when he hits enter on his keyboard. In any way, the form will be submitted and we want to call this function. Now we can see in the browser that whenever we click the button, the website will refresh. This is basically our signal that the form has been submitted. And this is exactly the behavior that we want to prevent if there are any errors in the input fields. To prevent the form from submitting, we can call the function e.preventDefault. The event object e is a very special object in event listeners. It contains a lot of properties and functions that we can use. This function will prevent the default behavior, which is submit. Therefore, the form will not be submitted if this function is called. We can see its effect when we click the button in the browser. This time, the website does not refresh. We are not submitting the form. For now, we can comment out this line because we don't have any errors. We only want to prevent the submitting when there are any errors. So let's create an array for the errors. We are going to fill this array with error messages for every error that we detect in the form. And then we're going to show these errors to the user so that he knows what to do. Since the signup and the login will not have the same input fields, we need to know somehow if we are currently in the signup page or the login page. I want to use the same JavaScript file for both pages, but the login will not have a first name or a repeat password. Only email and password will suffice. And that's why I create an if condition to ask for the existence of the first name input. If we have a first name input, then we are in the signup. And here I can say errors equals get signup form errors. This is a function that I'm going to create later. Else, meaning if we don't have a first name input, then we are in the login page. Here, errors equals get login form errors. So these are two separate functions where we will detect the errors inside the form. They will get the value of the input fields as arguments. We have the first name input.value, we have the email input.value, password input.value, and the repeat password input.value. The function for the login errors only needs the email input.value and the password input.value. The value property is just the text that the user entered. So when he enters his email address, we can get this email using email input.value, just so that you know. Let's write the error detecting for these functions. Function get signup form errors. We have the parameters first name, email, password, and repeat password. These are the values that the user entered in the form. Create an empty array for the errors. Each error will have its own if condition. For example, if first name triple equals empty string, that means if the user has not entered anything in the first name input, or first name equals null, which is pretty much the same. Then we take the errors array and push the message first name is required. By now, when the user hits submit without entering his first name, this error message will be pushed into the errors array. Now we also need to make it visible to the user by assigning our class incorrect. The first name input has a parent element, which is the div where the class needs to be, where we use classList.addIncorrect. Now, since we want to make every input element required, we can simply copy this several times and do the same thing for the email and the password. Just change all the variables to ask if the email is empty, then assign the class to the email inputs parent element, and adjust the error message email is required. And if the password is empty, then assign the class to the password inputs.parent element. The error message is password is required. At the end, we will return this errors array. So basically we have an array that goes through all of these if conditions, and if there are errors present, then the respective error message will be pushed inside the array. The errors will be returned into the variable up here, because this is where we are calling the function. Now we want to prevent the submit because there are errors. So we create an if condition. If errors.length is greater than 0, meaning if there are any errors inside the array, then we call event.preventDefault. This will prevent the submitting of the form. Now let's test this in the browser. If we have no content entered, so there will be 3 errors happening, I hit submit, and the stats will be applied perfectly, and the form is not submitted. But we can see our error messages. For that, we go to our HTML code and add a p tag with the ID error message. We're going to show our errors inside this element. We need to get this element into a const variable using getElementById. Now we use this variable and set its inner text to errors.join, and in the parentheses we use the dot. The join method can combine multiple strings of an array into one string, and we want to put a dot and a space between each sentence to have proper punctuation. Now when I hit submit, we get our error messages. First name is required, email is required, and password is required. To make it look even more like an error message, we can go to our CSS code and give the error message a red color. Great. Now we still have a big problem here. When the user gets an error and then he enters something new, the error will still be there and everything is red. I want to remove the errors when the user enters text. For that, we need an array all inputs. Here we're going to store all our inputs. First name input, email input, password input, and repeat password input. Then we say all inputs dot for each. Here we're going to apply the following for each input element. Input.addEventListener using the input event. Now we ask if the input.parent element.classList contains the class incorrect. Then we're going to remove this class from the element. So every input element has an event listener that will fire every time the user enters something in the input element. He's going to check if the element has the incorrect class, meaning the red styling. And if that is the case, the class will be removed. Let's test this in the browser. Now first I have my errors, and when I enter something, the red styling will go away. Now let's also remove the error message up here. We can simply declare error message.innerText equals empty string. Alright, and this should be working. Now let's add a few more errors to the sign-up validation. Since we want the user to repeat his password to make sure he really is creating a new account with a correct password, we need to check if the password is the same as the repeated password. So, if password not equals repeat password, we get an error, password does not match repeated password. Now let's test this. First, everything is correct, we enter all the values properly and the form will submit just fine. Now we make a mistake. We enter everything, but the repeated password is wrong. And we get the error message, password does not match repeated password. But I forgot to assign the incorrect class for the styling. So let's copy this and make the password input incorrect. We also make the repeat password input incorrect. Now both elements are red. We also want to have a secure password. It needs to be longer than 8 characters. So we check if the password.length is less than 8. Then we get the error, password must have at least 8 characters. And the password input.parent element gets the class incorrect. And that should be the form validation for the sign-up. You can add more if conditions if you want and check for a secure password. Just use the same steps that we already did here. Now let's focus on the login page. Currently we only have a sign-up. So we create a new file, login.html. Now we copy everything from the sign-up and paste it right here in the login. The login will be very similar to the signup. We only have to change a few things. The title is login, the h1 is login, we don't need the div for the first name input, and we also remove the repeat password input. So we will only be needing the email and the password. The submit button is now called login, and we also change the text down here. We asked new here, then create an account and reference the signup.html page here. That will help the users that accidentally land on the login to go to the signup. We can now use this link to see our login page. This page is very similar to the signup. The only problem is we have no form validation working here. Even though we have the correct JavaScript file imported, we still have to write the code for it. Remember, at the beginning we check if there is a first name input. This detects if we are in the signup or the login. Now in this case, we don't have a first name input. So we know that we are in the login and we use this function, getLoginFormErrors. But we haven't defined that function yet, have we? So let's do that now. Function getLoginFormErrors. The parameters are email and password. Here we can do the same thing for the login again. We have an empty errors array that we will return at the end of the function. Now we go to the signup and copy the if conditions for the email and the password. We can paste them directly into the login function. And once we got that, the validation will be working perfectly. Again, you can add more errors if you want. It's the same logic as before. But we actually have a tiny inconsistency that we need to take care of. In the browser console, we're getting errors in the login because we're trying to add event listeners to elements that don't exist. The all-inputs array contains all the input elements for the signup. Then we loop over them to add event listeners that remove the incorrect class. That way the red styling disappears properly. But in the login, we don't have that many input fields. We only have email and password. So first name and repeat password will cause errors here. So instead of doing everything again for the login, we can actually filter this array. We check if the input does not equal null. That means if the input element is not there, it will be null, and it will be filtered out of the array. The all-inputs array will only hold the input elements that are actually present. And then the for each loop works perfectly fine. And there you go, we have a functioning form validation for both login and signup. This form is now ready on the front-end side. You can connect this perfectly to your own backend. If you need the source code for this project, check out our website coding2go.com. There you can find other interesting stuff too. Let us know in the comments if you like longer projects like this one. If you have any problems with your code or video ideas you want to share, comment that below too. This was Coding2Go, and I will see you in the next video.